useEffect is pretty nice. What about cleanup work? And actually, I haven't even shown you this with the other components, with the class-based ones. So let's start with those. The persons.js component is a component which will actually get removed from the DOM when we click toggle persons. Now let's say in that case you want to do some cleanup work. Let's say in that scenario you want to clean up some event listeners you set up somewhere, anything like that. Any cleanup work you want to do. We got no such cleanup work here, but in an app where you do have a live connection to some server or something like that, it's a very realistic scenario that you do have to clean up some stuff. In a class-based component for this, you can add component will unmount here. And therefore here I'll console log persons.js component will unmount. We saw that on a slide earlier as well. If I now save that, this reloads, I get my alert here. I can toggle, and now if I toggle again, here we see component will unmount from persons.js. Now in here, you could have any code that needs to run right before the component is removed, so right before you get rid of it. If you're using hooks like we're doing in the cockpit.js file, then you also can use useEffect for this cleanup work. How does that work? Well, in your function you pass to your effect, so in this anonymous arrow function here in my case, you can return either nothing, so you don't have to have a return statement, but if you add one, you can return a function here. So here I'm using yet another anonymous function that will actually run after every render cycle. So here I can console log cockpit.js cleanup work in useEffect. With that added, let's see what this does. If I reload, I get this alert, and this is it. We have useEffect here. What you won't see is anything else. You never see that cleanup work thing because the cockpit component is actually never removed. Now to demonstrate how to get rid of it though, let's go to the app.js file. And let's add a new button here. Remove cockpit, just so that we can get rid of it. And in here, I will simply quick and dirty set some state, which I initialize up here. Show cockpit. Initially, that is true, so we start with the cockpit. And then in here on this button, I'll add an on-click listener. And I'll now really just do this quick and dirty and add an inline event handler, so an anonymous function which gets executed when the click occurs. And there I'll call this set state, and I'll set show cockpit to false. Now with that set to false when we click the button, now we can just wrap this here and check whether this state show cockpit is true. And if it is, we do render the cockpit, and otherwise we render nothing. The result of this is that we start with the cockpit, of course, but now we have the remove cockpit button, and if I click this, you actually see cleanup work in useEffect. That is coming from our React hook here, of course, because that runs right when useEffect runs for the last time, so to say. Now, when this is the case depends on this second argument you passed to useEffect. If you passed an empty array, useEffect will basically execute this function only, this function here, only when that component rendered and when it is unmounted. Now let me add another useEffect call here. As I mentioned, you can have more than one, which executes another anonymous function. And here, I will copy that console log for my second useEffect, and I will copy that return statement here. And here I have cleanup work in second useEffect. Now please note that this second useEffect has no second argument, so I'm not controlling when this should run, and therefore it will run for every update cycle. So now what we see is, here we have the second useEffect, and already now when I just toggle a persons, so I'm not doing anything with the cockpit. If I toggle persons, we got cockpit second useEffect, but before that, we had the cleanup work in the second useEffect. Now this can also be useful in case you have some operation which actually should be cancelled whenever the component re-renders, so after it updated, so to say. So this is an extra bit of flexibility that you have this cleanup function here, and you can either let this run when the component gets destroyed by passing an empty array as a second argument, or it runs on every update cycle with no argument. Or you pass a second argument, which is an array that lists all the data this should watch, and only when that data changes, it'll run the function in useEffect, and it'll then run the cleanup function too. Now that was a lot about lifecycle hooks and useEffect. Now I know that a lot of this stuff is still very abstract here, because we haven't really used it in a real project. We'll do so throughout the course, though there definitely are also scenarios and lifecycle hooks we'll rarely use because, well, you do rarely use them. I found it important to walk you through them so that you are aware of them, so that we can now use them in a project. And when we talk about hooks, there we'll have an entire module towards the end of the course where I'll take the finished course project and convert it to use React hooks only. So if you want to learn more about that, that will be covered as well. For now, let's move on with some performance optimizations and should component update though, because that is super important to know how to use since it's a powerful tool. Right now, I'm always returning true. And what this basically means is that React always goes ahead and re-renders the entire component tree for this component whenever something changes in this component. As I mentioned a couple of times, this does not mean that it updates the real DOM, as you will learn, but still, it does check whether it needs to update the real DOM internally, and if we can prevent this, we can already save some performance. So how can we work with should component update then?